could. Shabbat Shalom. That seemed a little tentative. You know what? These are a mystery to me. They have buttons on them. I have no idea what they do. How do you turn it off?
Hold down the button on the left.
Button on the left. It worked. We're going to spend a few minutes at Deuteronomy 3. There's something that, when you read the book of Deuteronomy, I think you're all aware that the book is really about obeying what God said. If you obey what God said, everything goes well. If you don't, you're in trouble. And the first part of this chapter, and I'll read the 7 verses. Verse 7 has something that I find troubling. And I think most of us do. But I think it has meaning that we need to incorporate into our lives. Then we turned and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, with all his people, came out to meet us in battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to me, do not fear him, for I have delivered him and all his people and his land into your hand. And you shall do to him just as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. So the Lord our God delivered Og also, king of Bashan, with all his people into our hand, and we smote them until no survivor was left. We captured all his cities at that time. There was not a city which we did not take from them. 60 cities, all the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan. All these were cities fortified with high walls, gates and bars, besides a great many unwalled towns. We utterly destroyed them, as we did to Sihon, king of Heshbon, utterly destroying the men, women, and children of every city. But all the animals and the spoil of the cities we took as our booty. Why do you think that the Torah and then the book of Joshua and then Judges brings it out again so emphasizes this: destroy everybody, everything that breathes, the men, the women, and the children? I know people that lost their belief in the Bible over this. They couldn't see how God would. And how do you handle that? One of the things that could make you nervous about this is that, how many of you have heard of the concept of manifest destiny? If you studied history, you'll know. Where did that come from? In some way, it came from here. That people interpreted that when we came into this country, we, the Europeans, had a destiny, and eliminating the natives was part of that destiny. And it had some really ugly fruit. So why does God emphasize this? And what's more, like I mentioned, both Joshua and Judges bring out that to the extent that Israel did not destroy the enemies, these people living amongst them brought them back to idolatry and brought them into judgment. And how do you process that today? And how many of you, and I'm guessing most of you, look at that, and at least one thing that you do is you think, well, for those of us who serve Yeshua, who are in the new covenant, where are we told that our battle is? Is it against flesh and blood? It's not. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but they're mighty to the pulling down of strongholds. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities. And so what do you get out of this when you read that? Does it have a meaning for us today? And then again, I'm brought to something that I memorized in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. And that's where Yeshua says, don't think that I've come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I haven't come to abolish, but to fulfill. And then he says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away. That's kind of plain. Heaven and earth are still here. Not the smallest letter or the slightest, how does it put it? Not the smallest letter or the least slightest stroke of a pen, I think of what it says in the NIV, will disappear from the Torah till everything is accomplished. So, all right, what does this mean to us? How do you teach this to somebody? What is the lesson? Because God is saying every word there is important, and your first reaction might be, this is too brutal. This is too strong. I think Greg had his hand up, and then Kaya.
There's another scripture that kind of goes along with that, that Jesus says, if you want to follow me, give up everything. And that may include friends, it may include brothers or sisters or family or whatever it may be. If those influences in our life would be of such power and potency that they would lead you away from the Lord and from serving Him, then what you have to do is you have to cut that off.
You can't compromise.
You can't compromise.
That's what Yeshua, what Jesus is saying, that compromise will destroy us. And sometimes that, we'll talk a little bit about this, that sometimes can be hard to know what that is. Kaya.
Well, I was gonna say, I have friends, atheists, who straight up see that as genocide, that God was ordaining genocide.
Oh, I'm sure, I can see.
And of course, today you still, I think, was it the guy that was smart? I don't know who it was. There was another guy who claimed that God told him to kill so-and-so and get these.
That's happened many times.
Anyway, this stuff happens all the time. And it is something I think anybody who reads the scripture, you have to wrestle through and say, if God never changes, what changed? Because, and one of the things that I kind of do, and I don't know if this is legal or not, but this is how it is reconciled to my heart, and that's taking the eternal perspective. That what happens on this earth is, God's intention is to bring heaven to earth.
Exactly.
What's in heaven to earth. And so, what He has done sometimes on this earth seems so final and so devastating, whatever, that we don't understand the eternal consequences. And I think sometimes when we, quote unquote, have them wipe people out, it wasn't they would send them to hell. And I think that's where immediately we go with the Christian framework that we've been raised in. But scripturally speaking, if you look at that, go and cut someone off or destroy them, they were being devoted to God. There was another term that was used. It wasn't necessarily that they were being sent to hell. In some cases, some of those women and children their souls were actually being saved through that, so that they were not brought into the corruption that other. Anyway, the way I look at that is that we don't know what was being done from an eternal perspective.
And I think that's a really good perspective, because so often we judge what God does as good or bad, but what we mean, it was good or bad to me. And we're not God. The thing that I would bring out in this too is wherever God asks for this brutal destroy them is always only one place, and that's in the land. Which I take this to mean, and maybe I'm taking liberties with it, kind of goes to what both of you have said, is that He's saying the enemy you find in you, you've got to be ruthless with that enemy. The enemy you find in your brother or sister, that's not your problem. That isn't even your job. I mean, you can be part of the process of healing there, but taking care of yourself. And what you'll notice, this human nature that we talk about, there's something in us as humans that feels very strongly that we can fix what's in our brother or sister. But we don't feel any inclination to fix what's in us. How did Yeshua address that? Remember what He said? He said, be careful how you talk to each other, because the first thing you need to do is what? Take the log out of your eye before you take the splinter out of your brother. So He put that in perspective. But I think one of the things we need to realize too is that in our land, my land and your land, different things will be the enemy. And so I can look at Dave and think, well, Dave has that thing, and that's an enemy to me. Dave needs to take care of that, where that may not be Dave's first priority. God can tell him that. And I mean, I can point out some things very clearly. Take alcohol. There are billions of people that use alcohol, and it never causes a problem. There are a lot of people that it destroys their lives. They can't have a drop. I know a lot of people this way. The way they have victory is they say, that's not coming in. If I see that in, it's like I'm going to slay the infants, the adult. That is not in my life, because when it gets in my life, when it comes in my house, it destroys me. I can't make peace with this. I can't equivocate with it. And I think one of the dangerous things we have, and I've mentioned this a lot, but I think it's important in our culture today, is we hear the voice of the culture and it lulls us to sleep. And one of the things I'm going to talk about right now is abortion, and I realize we can talk about this too much. But here's a danger, that we've come to a place in our society where it is a right to extinguish the life of a fetus. You know, just on the surface of it, how does that sound? It doesn't sound right. But how did this happen? And there's a lot of understanding that goes into this that we don't all have. You've got to, again, be very careful how you judge people. But what's happening to us as a society since 1973, when Roe versus Wade was okayed? Would you say that the sanctity of life has increased, or has it decreased? It's decreased, because this enemy is in our land and we don't know how to handle it. And I took a story, and this is the Reader's Digest version. And this is the title of her little thing. I had an abortion, and I'm not a murderer. She had worked for Planned Parenthood, and so this is where I start. I was a walking contraception encyclopedia. But after trying every form of birth control on the market, I knew that the more effective forms of hormonal birth control were not for me. Then she says, in a whim of passion and attraction, I got pregnant. My boyfriend was torn. In his own life, pregnancy had always been celebrated and welcomed as a gift. How many of you know that when someone says they're expecting, what's the reaction? You're so glad, you're so thankful. Someone's coming into the family. It's a new life. And it's a miracle, too. You know, human beings, God has given us the ability to participate in creation. We can't create. We don't have that ability. We can participate with God. So he's kind of torn. It had always been celebrated, and he felt that love was the only necessary condition for parenting. I sat on the opposite side of our decision-making spectrum. She was on the verge of completing an expensive graduate program. She only had a modest employment. She wasn't making a lot of money. There wasn't a single doubt in my mind that my pregnancy was due to be aborted. I want you to think about that for a minute. And then this statement. I love my boyfriend, but when I searched my heart, there was no love for the new life inside me. If you think I'm attacking this girl, I'm not. I'm asking you, how do we come to a place where we make compromise and we make allowance for evil? It doesn't happen overnight, does it? I've been married to my wife for almost 50 years. I can tell you when there's a baby inside of her, when something's in there, she loves that baby the minute it's conceived. She treasures that baby. And all the women that I've been around, it's instinctive. No one says, you know, you're going to have a baby. You should love the baby. But here's this lady that says, I knew this baby was due to be aborted, and there was no love in me for it. Why do we love a fetus? Why? Because we want it? Kaya.
Do you think that's what it means when it says the love of many will grow cold? That Titus or that?
Because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. That's Yeshua, Jesus.
Oh.
No, it definitely says that. And here's the thing. I want you to see this is a good person who's trying to make it in life. And how do our minds, because I don't think we realize right now that in our society, because we don't know how to draw God's lines, we're drawing our own, and they're not working. And you have to be so careful, that's why I brought up Manifest Destiny, that you don't use the Bible to injure people. If we're using the Bible to injure people, that doesn't sound like the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh. Okay, Greg, go ahead.
Many of us, and I think you do have to be very, very sensitive when you deal with subjects like abortion, but one subject that is just exactly the same type of situation is in our country right now. It's perfectly acceptable in a lot of areas to become a transgender, which means, to me, as I looked at it and read about it, is that people come to a place where they absolutely destroy what God created them to be. And it's very, very similar to abortion. We can't live with this person. We can't live with this thing that's inside the mother. We can't live with the person who I am. So we're going to destroy it. And we're going to take every step and every measure that we can to destroy that unique thing that God created. And I think that is something that's become, it's become culturally acceptable to be able to do things like that. And so it's the same thing with abortion. What makes us embrace those kinds of things? It's the maybe question, and you do have to be sensitive because it's not a one-size-fits-all. But people, I don't know what finally tips them over the edge to say, we hate this thing so much, this personality, this thing that we are, that we're just going to destroy it.
Well, I mean, you bring out something that we don't have a lot of time, might touch on a little, and that's, like you say, you got to be sensitive. The transgender thing, the whole sexual arena right now in our country is very unbiblical. And yet, as those who are called to be redeemers, this is going to be a challenge going forward, how you reach out to this world. But, and you look at this thing again. I have to take care of my own land. What does that look like? And I'll just read you a few more things about her. This is what struck me about this was that she was torn by this decision, but she felt like she had to stand for the right to have an abortion, because that's, and I thought, we are, as human beings, this can happen, where we have made a decision and everything in us knows it's wrong, and we just can't stop. She says, I still recall sobbing on my kitchen floor the night before my abortion. I had opted to have a surgical abortion, but that entailed waiting until I was 6 weeks pregnant. In the meantime, I entertained several self-abortive strategies, from acupuncture to yoga, herbs to diet, meditation to exercise. Yet the pregnancy persisted beyond every attempt, and my symptoms swelled. In the days leading up to my abortion, I developed a particular respect for my pregnancy's unwavering capacity to overwhelm me, and even began to wonder if I was stopping something meant to last. Those words chilled me, because the thing inside of her wanted to live. And she said, as she sobbed on the floor, she longed to hear her mom's voice. Anyway, she had her abortion. She didn't want her boyfriend or her friends to go with her. It was an uneventful procedure. And she said the months that followed solidified my decision in the ways that the days prior to my abortion could not. I completed my graduate program. I enjoyed my brother's wedding. His wife was pregnant, and she said, I felt no regret over my pregnancy loss. She said, I felt that I had invited a certain level of destruction into my life. My once perfect cycle was erratic and predictable. And she says, while I know that abortion is a beautiful, even triumphant fact of life, and I thought, and I don't, you have to be so careful here. I wonder how much of the problem here is really idolatry. Who's God in this? Just something for you to think about. Who's God? And then she said, and then she got pregnant later, and she felt like the abortion prepared her for the beautiful son that she's got. And the whole thing was just well stated and hard for me. And you'll hear me trying to be sensitive because I'm not in her shoes. And I'm also not subjected to this information. then her concluding statement, sex is everywhere, abortion is a fact of life, everyone knows this. And I would just have you ponder, what do you and I do in our lives, in the line that God has drawn around us as an individual? Do you keep things out that will chip away until they change you? And, you know, what I think is amazing is that we've had these examples before. Slavery is another classic example. People don't like to link slavery to abortion, but they are so similar. They're not identical, but they're similar in this respect. The one with the power makes the decisions that hurt the one without the power, and the one without the power is better off because I'm able to make this decision. I see it again as idolatry. Could be wrong. But you know the person that wrote the words, all men are created equal? Who said that? Who wrote that in the Declaration? Thomas Jefferson. When he said that, he was flying in the face of this statement from Aristotle, which was what the world had believed before. From the hour of their birth, some men are marked out for subjection, others for rule. And Jefferson came along and says, no. All men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. And what were those rights? The pursuit of life. And you know what's interesting about this is the language Jefferson wanted to include in the Declaration, he had to trim it out. Why? Because he left it in there, there were a group of states that would not have ratified it. Listen to some of this language. The slave trade is an execrable commerce, the assemblage of horrors, a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberties. If we'd left those in the Declaration, the United States would have been committed to abolishing slavery in the slave trade. We took it out because it made people uncomfortable. Massachusetts, based on the Declaration, banned slavery in 1780. And again, you'll think I'm picking on Jefferson, and I find Jefferson so human. I'm human enough to identify with some of it. Jefferson, I will say, some of the southern states that didn't like all men are created equal, you know what they changed it to? All free men are equal. Be terrified of definitions that play with what you know to be absolutely true. What we know about a fetus, it's alive. If it's okay to kill it, let's use the language. We're going to kill it. We're going to stop a beating heart. We're going to stop something that is unique genetically. It has its own unique combination of DNA. Let's just be honest. What I thought was interesting about Jefferson is that as his plantation grew and depended on slavery, he came to the place where he did not want to emancipate his slaves. He wasn't even for it. He was reputed to be a gentle slave owner, but his slaves suffered the lash. And as the longer he went with it, it got to the place where it wasn't good. And I was reading this history, and I thought, how did this happen to him? It happened because something he knew shouldn't be inside his circle, inside his land, he allowed it in there. Leave it in there long enough, and it's going to be okay. I don't care what it is. And I don't care who you are. If you're not able to say, by the hand of God, I'm killing this thing, it's not going to be in my life. Because what happened when he died, he was going to free all his slaves, he didn't. He freed a few. He freed some and didn't free their families. A fellow named Joseph Fawcett, he was promised, he was the blacksmith. He was promised his family would be freed. He was set free. His wife and kids weren't. He went to all the buyers of his family and said, what do you want? I'll pay you. He worked 10 years to buy his kids and his wife back. And when he went to them with the money, half of them reneged and said, no, we're not going to do it. And one of Joseph's sons, his name was Peter, in 1898, when he was 83, he recalled vividly the horror of being put up on the auction block and sold like a horse. If you don't think it can happen anytime we decide man can figure out what's right and wrong. I think the same thing with sexual freedoms. We're so enjoying our sex. You know, we talk about the pandemic, and it's been serious. In 2021, January, 20% of the U.S. population has an STD. That's not a pandemic. That's something on a... You know what? It's completely unnecessary. It is completely unnecessary. But why are we willing to put up with that? Because of my freedom, which comes at the expense of someone else. And I totally am not here to say Christians should go out in society and mandate society follow us. But we should do what God has told us to do. Do you know right now the world can look at the church and we don't seem to do any different in this area than they do, so why should they follow us? I love the cartoon about the man who's talking to his son, and he said, I know the perfect cure, the thing that will keep AIDS out of the country forever. And his son said, what? His dad held up his hand, a wedding ring. I was looking through this and thinking, article came out in the Deseret News yesterday about pornography. And you know what's happening with pornography? Exactly what's happened with abortion and slavery. It started off by being awful. We let it stand around. And you know, I like to read what it said, so if it's wrong, it's their fault. 70% of Americans are somewhat accepting of pornography viewing. How would you say that's changed in the last 50 years? A fourth of men don't see a problem with teens watching porn. Have you seen any studies on what porn does to teens' minds? Doesn't this make you happy? They did these EEG, electroencephalogram. They did studies of the mind, and they showed men tools, and they showed men scantily clad women. It triggered the same place in their head because the girls were going to be used. Pornography is not about loving and cherishing. Again, we're not going to change the world, but we need to be changed ourselves. These things are real, and you know, Yeshua said some things that were kind of hard. He said, this is the judgment. Lights come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light. Did you know we keep proving this? For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God. And something I want to make sure that I bring up here today. If we don't believe, and I don't, that God wants us to kill people, that he's not asking us to enact violence on other people. Do you know one of the most violent places in America today is the pulpit? There's something wrong with this. There's a widely butchered statement that's very profane concerning the president. This is being chanted in churches. That is letting something inside that can't be there. Do you know Yeshua was kind of revolutionary? He said, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say what? Love your enemies. Do good to them that persecute you. Why? That you might be sons of your Father in heaven. And then I've got a bunch of people who I love and respect who are justifying this absolute coarse language about the president, saying he's not a good person. It's not about him. It's about you. It's about, do you look like Yeshua? Not all the time. But if we're going to let this inside, we'll look like the world. And if we fight the flesh with the flesh, what's going to come of that? I think we all know. Joey mentioned Sukina singing some songs, and he sang some beautiful songs. One was from Ezekiel 37. There was another one, and I forget it was from Isaiah. And it was just fantastic. And it uses the language of the Scripture talking about restoring and building the land. And the fellow that had written it was a Native American. And he died of an overdose about 20 years after he wrote the song. And it was one of those things that just so tore at my heart. Because in some way, he didn't know how to keep out of his house the things that pulled him down. And sometimes, we can be responsible for each other. We can be strong for each other. We can be there. And if there's anything I struggle with, it's intimacy. Because I'd like everyone to be happy and fine and just leave me right out here just approving. Life is dirty. It's messy. And everyone here has helped someone by being willing to be there, to be a redemptive ripple, to be something that stands for the truth, and rarely is condemning going to help. Rarely is pointing the finger and shouting people down. It's not going to help. When I read this chapter, I love the way it ends, and yet it tore at my heart. Moses said, Lord, I've been with the people all through the wilderness, and now we see the land. Can't I go in with them? Can't I just go in and see the promised land? And the Lord said, nope. Just go up to the top of the mountain, and I'll let you see it all. But he lets Moses know, he says, your life wasn't in vain. You spent your life for those coming behind you. And I think if there's anything the Lord would impress upon us today, we don't know what the Lord will do with us, but we can spend our lives so those coming behind us have got an inheritance. And it means we've got to stand for the truth. It means we have to say, Lord, don't let me allow these idols inside my house. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And it's an exciting time to live. God is doing wonderful things. Allow him to focus your eyes on the redemptive acts that he's doing. And the fact that Yeshua, Jesus, is still entering hearts. He's still changing people. But sometimes the way that he reaches people is through you laying your life down. I know I wouldn't be who I am without family, friends, that basically did what Moses did. They gave everything. They didn't, like Hebrews 11 said, they didn't see the object of their faith, but they died believing and continuing on. It's a wonderful time to live. It is not a good time to compromise. It's not a good time to let go of the things that God has told us. You have this in your house and not that. If you see that in your house, destroy it, remove it. Don't have anything to do with this compromise that destroys the foundation of who we are. And I think it was Lois that said, we have one foundation. No foundation, no other foundation can any man lay, but that which is laid, which is Yeshua, which is Jesus. And I'm so grateful for that. Let's all stand. Brother Dave, would you close for us, please?